In the high-stakes world of Ivy League academia, the afternoons are usually defined by the quiet intensity of pursuit. On December 13, 2025, the Barris and Holly Engineering Building at Brown University was a sanctuary of that pursuit. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of recycled coffee and the frantic scribbling of equations on whiteboards. Students were gathered in a focused study session, their minds occupied by the complexities of the future, completely unaware that the consistency of their lives was seconds away from an absolute fracture. It was a Saturday afternoon, a time when the Providence campus usually feels like a fortress of intellectual safety. But as the clock moved past 2 p.m., that safety was compromised. A figure obscured by a mask and moving with a terrifyingly deliberate pace entered the engineering hall. What followed was not a robbery or a confrontation. It was an event of immediate and profound horror. In the span of a few heartbeat lengths, the bright, sterile environment of the lecture hall was transformed. Ella Cook, a vibrant nursing student known for her leadership, and Mohammad Aziz Umarzokov, a brilliant mind dedicated to the mysteries of neuroscience, lost their lives. 9 other students were left with injuries that would rewrite their futures. The transition from a study session to a tragedy was instantaneous. The panic that followed was a wave that moved through the Providence campus with a speed no alert system could match. As the shelter-in-place orders flashed across thousands of smartphones, the university became a ghost town. Students barricaded themselves in libraries and dormitories, listening to the distant, haunting wail of sirens that seemed to come from every direction at once. For the first responders, the scene was an overwhelming confusion. The Barris and Holly building is a labyrinth of laboratories and offices, and in the initial minutes, no one knew if the threat was singular or if the danger was still moving through the halls. The air was filled with the metallic tang of fear and the shouted commands of tactical units trying to make sense of a situation that defied the peaceful history of the institution. This was the beginning of a story that would eventually stretch from the gates of Brown to the research labs of MIT, a story of 2 separate tragedies that the world would soon learn were connected by a single calculated mind. But on that December afternoon, there were only questions, a heavy silence over Providence, and the beginning of a manhunt for a person who had already begun to leave a trail of words that no one was yet ready to hear. Before we continue with this chilling story, we will like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like cases like this one. While the city of Providence was still reeling from the events at Brown University, the narrative of this tragedy was quietly preparing to expand. 2 days after the Barris and Holly incident, the scene shifted to Brookline, an area known for its academic heritage and its profound sense of security. On the evening of December 15th, that security was dismantled. Neighbors in a quiet residential pocket reported hearing a series of sharp, rhythmic sounds that were initially mistaken for late-season construction, but were soon identified as something far more definitive. This was the residence of Professor Nuno F.G. Luero. To the world of science, Luero was a titan, a world-renowned nuclear physicist at MIT and a visionary in the study of plasma physics. To his neighbors, he was a devoted father and a man of quiet, immense intellect. But on that night, his home became a second scene, and his life became the latest chapter in a story that was no longer confined to a single campus. The arrival of the authorities in Brookline marked the moment the link began to form. In the early hours of the investigation, the 2 events, the campus shooting in Rhode Island and the targeted attack in Massachusetts, appeared to be geographically and motivationally distinct. One was a public tragedy. The other was an intimate, targeted assassination. However, the science of ballistics does not recognize distance as a barrier. When the initial shell casings were recovered from the Luero home and compared to the evidence gathered from the Barras and Holly lecture hall, the results were undeniable. The markings on the brass told a story of a single source. The metal carried the same unique signatures, proving that the tools used in both locations were identical. This forensic bridge was reinforced by a second, more visible clue. Surveillance footage from a nearby intersection in Brookline captured a gray Nissan rental car leaving the area shortly after the sounds were heard. When federal investigators cross-referenced this vehicle with regional rental data, they discovered the same car had been recorded by a license plate reader near the Brown University campus on the afternoon of December 13th. The gray Nissan was no longer just a car. It was a mobile link between the two of the most prestigious institutions in the world. To understand the magnitude of what was being lost, we have to look closer at the victims, individuals whose lives represented the very best of their respective fields. At Brown, there was Ella Cook. In the years leading up to 2025, Ella had become a pillar of campus life. A nursing student with a relentless drive for service, she was the person her peers turned to for leadership and empathy. She represented the future of healthcare, a life dedicated to the preservation of others. Beside her was Muhammad Aziz Umarzokov, a brilliant neuroscience student who had traveled across the world to pursue his research. Muhammad was described by his professors as a visionary in the making. He was a young man whose work aimed to unlock the secrets of the human mind, a mind that was itself a masterpiece of intellectual potential. And then there was Professor Nuno Luero. At MIT, he was more than just a faculty member. He was a father of three and a scientist whose work in nuclear fusion was paving the way for clean energy solutions that could change the planet. He was a man who lived at the intersection of complex mathematics and human warmth. The connection between these three individuals was not immediately apparent. They belonged to different universities, different generations, and different disciplines. But as the investigation into the gray Nissan and the ballistics continued, a terrifying reality began to surface. These were not random choices. The perpetrator was not striking at the community at large. He was striking at specific symbols of success, intellectual brilliance, and future potential. As the task force moved from the labs of MIT to the dorms of Brown, the profile of the man they were hunting began to sharpen. They were no longer looking for a disorganized intruder. They were looking for someone who understood the geography of these institutions, someone who moved through the academic world with a familiarity that suggested he had once been a part of it. The silence over Brookline was a different kind of silence than the one over Providence. It was the silence of a targeted strike, a professional removal of a brilliant mind. As the gray Nissan moved toward its final destination, the community was left to wonder how a single individual could harbor a grudge that spanned 2 cities and 3 decades of academic excellence. The link was established, the victims were honored, and the hunt for the man in the gray Nissan was about to enter its most critical phase. While the physical investigation was spanning state lines, a parallel effort was unfolding in the digital landscape. In the days following the Providence tragedy, the internet became a repository for fear, speculation, and, eventually, the truth. On the Providence subreddit, a user who had come to be known by the pseudonym John began to post. His words were not the typical noise of a true crime forum. They were grounded in a specific, lived encounter that had occurred just hours before the Barras and Holly shooting. John described an encounter with a man he had seen casing the campus as early as late November. On the day of the shooting, John first encountered this individual in the ground floor bathroom of the engineering building. He described the suspect's clothing as inappropriate and inadequate for the weather, a flimsy light jacket that seemed out of place in the New England December. What followed was what John described as a game of cat and mouse. He watched the man exit the building and approach a gray Nissan Sentra with Florida plates parked near the Rhode Island Historical Society. When the man saw John watching him, his behavior shifted instantly. He backed away from the vehicle and began to circle the block, leading John on a low-speed pursuit through the streets of College Hill. At one point, John confronted him, asking a simple, logical question. "Your car is back there. Why are you circling the block?" The response was cold and dismissive. "I don't know you from nobody. Why are you harassing me?" John's Reddit post, urging police to look for a rental car with Florida tags, is what the Rhode Island Attorney General would later say blew the case wide open. This digital lead provided the missing piece of the puzzle. By December 16th, investigators used John's information to trace the vehicle to an Alamo rent-a-car in Boston. The identification was immediate. The rental documents pointed to a 48-year-old Portuguese national named Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. As his name entered the federal database, a history of academic brilliance and professional stagnation began to emerge. Valente was a former Brown graduate student who had been enrolled in the physics PhD program in 2000. He had once walked these very halls as a student, the same halls he would later return to with a radically different intent. The discovery of Valente's identity triggered a pursuit that lasted 72 hours. This was not a high-speed chase, but a methodical, high-stakes tracking of a ghost. Using automated license plate readers, the FBI and state police realized that Valente was no longer in Providence or Brookline. He had crossed state lines, moving north into New Hampshire. The gray Nissan had been observed intermittently between December 1st and December 12th, parked in the shadows of the university he once attended. Now it was being tracked through the snowy corridors of New England highways. Investigators discovered that Valente had been living a nomadic existence, staying in hotels in late November before renting the Nissan on December 1st. The tension of those 72 hours was extreme. FBI and state police knew they were hunting a man who had already taken lives at 2 different locations and who possessed an intimate knowledge of the scientific and academic communities he was targeting. Every hour he remained at large was another hour of potential danger for the faculty and students of the region. As the search narrowed, the digital footprint of the gray Nissan led the FBI to a final, desolate location, a storage facility in Salem, New Hampshire. The man who had been a top student in Portugal and a doctoral candidate at an Ivy League school had retreated to a 10-by-10 metal unit. He had built a life within those corrugated walls, a life defined by a decades-old grudge and a meticulously planned ending. The digital detectives had done their part. The Reddit hero had provided the spark, the ballistics had provided the proof, and the license plate readers had provided the path. But as the tactical teams surrounded the Salem storage facility on December 18th, they were not just closing in on a suspect. They were about to uncover an archive of confessions that would leave the community with more questions than answers. By December 18, 2025, the digital and physical breadcrumbs had converged on a single point in the New England landscape. This was the end of the trail. After days of tracking the gray Nissan through the corridors of the Northeast, federal agents and local tactical units arrived at a storage facility in Salem, New Hampshire. It was a place designed for the forgotten, a grid of corrugated metal doors housing the discarded fragments of other people's lives. When the authorities breached the unit associated with Claudio Manuel Neves Valente, the transition from a manhunt to a recovery mission was instantaneous. Inside, they found the suspect. He had ended his own life, choosing a finality that mirrored the events he had initiated in Providence and Brookline. The man who had once been a scholar of the most complex physical laws of the universe had concluded his own story in a 10-by-10 metal box. The storage unit itself provided a window into the reality Valente occupied in the weeks and perhaps months leading up to the tragedy. It was a sterile, cold environment, devoid of any comfort or the warmth of a traditional home. Investigators described a scene of radical minimalism. There were no photographs, no sentimental tokens, only the barest essentials for survival and the specialized tools he had used to carry out his plan. The air inside was stagnant, carrying the sharp metallic tang of the surrounding walls. It was a space that suggested a man who had already detached himself from the world long before he ever picked up a weapon. As forensic teams began to process this final scene, they uncovered what would become the most significant piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Tucked away on a small makeshift desk was an electronic device, a tablet that had been carefully positioned as if waiting to be found. Upon initial analysis, investigators realized the device was not just a repository of data, but a curated legacy. It contained a series of short videos that the public would later come to know as the confession tapes. These recordings were not the frantic ramblings of a man in crisis. Instead, they were delivered with a calm, academic precision that was deeply unsettling. Valente sat before the camera, speaking primarily in Portuguese, and methodically detailed the logic behind his actions. These tapes transformed the investigation. They moved the case from a search for who to a terrifyingly clear explanation of why. The videos were time-stamped, showing that Valente had been recording his thoughts in the days between the Brown University shooting and the Brookline assassination. He was documenting his own transition from a ghost in the academic system to a perpetrator of history. The discovery at Salem did more than just provide closure to the manhunt. It provided a voice to the vacuum. In these recordings, Valente addressed the world he felt had ignored him, using the language of a man who believed he was finally being heard. As the forensic specialists worked to decrypt and translate the files, they realized they were looking at a roadmap of a grudge that had been nurtured for decades. The storage unit was no longer just a cold room in New Hampshire, it was a library of a meticulously planned ending. The confession tapes ensured that while Valente was gone, his words would remain, forming a trail of evidence that would eventually shock the community more than the crimes themselves. The silence of the storage facility was about to be broken by the voice of the man who occupied it, as the investigation moved into the translation and release of the most chilling academic confession in modern history. In early January 2026, the silence surrounding the Salem storage facility was finally broken. The Department of Justice released the first 3 segments of the confession tapes, translated from Claudio Manuel Neves Valente's native Portuguese. What the world heard was not the voice of a man consumed by the heat of the moment, but a man defined by a terrifyingly focused coldness. Valente spoke with the cadence of a professor delivering a lecture, his tone devoid of the emotional markers one might expect from someone who had just dismantled 3 lives. He addressed the camera as if he were explaining a complex physical formula, logical, step by step, and completely detached from the human cost of his actions. In Confession 1, Valente provided the first glimpse into the timeline of his intent. He admitted that the attack on Brown University was not a sudden break from reality, it was a long-term project. In his own words, he had been working out the logistics for at least 6 semesters. The revelation sent a shockwave through the academic community. 6 semesters meant that while students were enrolling in classes, while Ella Cook was leading her campus organizations, and while Muhammad Aziz Umarzakov was arriving from Uzbekistan with dreams of neuroscience, Valente was already there, invisible, calculating his return. He had spent 3 years maintaining that storage unit in New Hampshire, using it as a staging ground for a tragedy that he viewed as a professional obligation rather than a crime. But the tapes also revealed a strange internal conflict. In Confession 2, Valente shifted from his planning to his failures. He spoke candidly about chickening out during previous semesters. He detailed numerous missed opportunities, moments where he had been on campus, armed and ready, only to find himself paralyzed by what he called inertia. He described sitting in his rental cars, watching the flow of students and faculty, and simply being unable to cross the threshold. To Valente, these were not moments of conscience or moral hesitation, they were technical failures. He viewed his own humanity, his fear and his hesitation, as a flaw in his execution. This insight into his psychology suggests a man who was fighting against his own instincts to complete a task he had set for himself, treating the act of violence as a hurdle he was frustrated he couldn't clear sooner. By the time we reach Confession 3, the tone shifts from frustration with himself to frustration with the environment. Valente expressed a sharp, biting irritation that the events at Brown did not unfold as he had visualized. He had intended to act in a regular room, a small, contained classroom where he could control every variable. Instead, he found himself in an auditorium in the Barris and Holly building. He described the experience as incompetent. He was angry that the larger space allowed for what he perceived as chaos. In the video, he even ridicules the students, expressing annoyance that they didn't react according to his expectations. This is perhaps the most disturbing element of the first 3 tapes. Valente's total lack of empathy is replaced by a critique of his own performance. He wasn't mourning the victims, he was mourning the purity of his plan. He also used this segment to address the noise of the outside world. He explicitly mocked the social media theories that had surfaced during the manhunt, specifically dismissing claims that he had shouted religious slogans. He clarified that if he said anything at all, it was likely an exclamation of disappointment because he initially thought the room was empty. As these tapes were analyzed by forensic psychologists in the first weeks of 2026, a portrait emerged of a man who viewed his life as a series of academic and professional disappointments. By planning this for 6 semesters, he was attempting to exert a final, absolute control over a world he felt had rejected him. He didn't want to be famous, and he insisted these videos were not a manifesto. He simply wanted to leave on his own terms, viewing the lives he took as incidental to his own exit strategy. The first 3 confessions established the how and the when, but the why remained buried in the decades of history he shared with Professor Loureiro, a history that would be explored in the final and most personal segments of the tapes. As the analysis of the tapes continued into late January 2026, the investigation encountered a profound psychological wall. In Confession 4, the tone shifts from the logistics of the event to a definitive statement of remorselessness. In what has become the most widely discussed segment of the recordings, Valente stares directly into the lens and explicitly states that he has nothing to apologize for. His reasoning was as cold as the storage unit he occupied. He presented a worldview defined by a perceived lack of reciprocity from society. "No one sincerely apologized to me in my life," he claimed, leaning into the camera with a flat, unwavering gaze. To Valente, his actions were not a transgression against the community, but a balancing of a metaphorical ledger. He viewed himself as a victim of a system that had failed to recognize his brilliance, and in his mind, that perceived slight granted him the authority to act without the burden of guilt. This was the ultimate confession through logic, a man who had replaced the moral compass of a model neighbor with a rigid, self-serving philosophy of grievance. This philosophy became even more specific in Confession 5, where the narrative turned toward the MIT link. For the first time, Valente provided the context for the targeted strike in Brookline. He revealed that he and Professor Nuno Loureiro were not strangers, they were ghosts from each other's past. They had attended the same prestigious university in Portugal decades ago, walking the same corridors of physics and mathematics as young men with seemingly infinite potential. However, their paths had diverged in a way that Valente clearly could not reconcile. While Loureiro became a visionary scientist and a beloved father at MIT, Valente had drifted to the margins, living in storage units and driving rental cars. While the tapes offer no specific motive in terms of a single event or a documented argument, Valente's words are heavy with the weight of a professional and personal grudge that had been nurtured since their time in Portugal. He spoke of Loureiro not as a person, but as a symbol of the life he felt he deserved. He hinted at debts of recognition and professional slights that existed only in his own memory. To the world, Nuno Loureiro was a titan of nuclear physics. To Valente, he was a reminder of every missed opportunity and every perceived failure of the last 30 years. This revelation moved the case away from a random act of violence and into the territory of a calculated removal of a peer, a man who had succeeded where Valente felt he had been ignored. The MIT link proved that Valente's planning for 6 semesters was fueled by more than just general frustration. It was a focused academic envy that had survived decades of silence. He didn't want to apologize because, in his internal narrative, he was the one who had been wronged by the success of others. The tapes show a man who had spent 30 years looking at the world through a lens of comparison, eventually deciding that the only way to resolve the equation was to remove the variables that made his own life seem insufficient. As investigators in 2026 cross-referenced these claims with historical records from Portugal, they found no evidence of a formal dispute or a professional theft. The grudge was internal, a private fire that Valente had kept burning in the shadows of his nomadic life. By the time he reached the storage unit in Salem, the distinction between reality and his own resentment had completely dissolved. He was no longer a student or a scientist. He was the architect of a final, remorseless statement against the people he felt had outpaced him. As we reach the conclusion of the confession tapes, the narrative shifts from the history of a grudge to the mechanics of a final departure. In Confession 6, Claudio Manuel Neves Valente lays out what he calls his exit strategy. Speaking with a calm that contradicts the gravity of his words, he explains that his objective was never survival or evasion in the long term. Instead, he reveals a philosophy of absolute control. He states that his primary goal was to leave on his own terms. In his view, the world had dictated the conditions of his life for 48 years, providing him with academic opportunities only to leave him in professional isolation. By orchestrating the events in Providence and Brookline, he believed he was finally taking the lead. He explicitly mentions that he wanted to ensure he wasn't the one suffering the most. This statement provides a window into a deeply transactional view of human emotion. He believed that by inflicting a permanent loss on the community and the families of his victims, he was effectively offloading his own decades of perceived misery. It was a final, calculated exchange. This leads directly into the most startling segment of the recordings, Confession 7. In this video, Valente addresses the witness encounter on the Brown University campus, the moment he was noticed by the individual the world now knows as John, the Reddit hero. Valente admits that he was confronted by John near the Rhode Island Historical Society. He describes the encounter with a sense of clinical surprise. He notes that the witness was remarkably observant, noticing the inconsistencies in his clothing and the way he was moving through the neighborhood. However, the true revelation in this confession is Valente's commentary on the investigation itself. He stares into the camera and admits he was surprised it took the FBI so long to find him. He had expected the digital trail of the gray Nissan and the physical description provided by the witness to lead authorities to his door within 24 hours. This arrogance suggests that he viewed the manhunt as a formal evaluation of his own planning versus the efficiency of the law, and in his final moments, he felt the system had failed even in its pursuit of him. Finally, the narrator's voice adopts a tone of necessary clarification as we reach the debunking portion of the final video. During the height of the manhunt, the vacuum of information was filled with intense speculation. Online forums and news cycles were saturated with theories suggesting political affiliations or religious radicalization. Valente used his final moments on camera to explicitly set the record straight. He stated with a dismissive hand that he was not acting for any political cause, nor was he motivated by any religious doctrine. He called the misinformation spread during the manhunt intellectually lazy. He insisted that his actions were purely personal, a culmination of an internal logic that belonged to him and him alone. By debunking these theories, he ensured that the public could not use a broad ideology to explain away his choices. He wanted the world to know that this was the work of a single mind acting on a singular history of resentment. This final act of setting the record right serves as a reminder of the power of a confession. Even in his departure, Valente sought to control the narrative, ensuring that his legacy remained tied to his own words rather than the theories of the crowd. The final terms were not a plea for understanding, but a demand for the acknowledgement of his own isolated reality. In the weeks following the events of December 2025, the academic world found itself in a period of profound aftermath. The shock that had gripped Providence and Brookline began to transform into a somber, focused resolve. At Brown University, the administration launched an immediate and comprehensive reevaluation of campus safety policies. The Boris and Holly building, once a site of quiet study, became the center of a national conversation on how to protect open academic environments while maintaining the accessibility that defines these institutions. Meanwhile, just north in Cambridge, MIT was forced to mourn a titan of physics. The loss of Professor Nuno Loureiro left a void that was not only intellectual but deeply personal. His colleagues and students spoke of him not just as a visionary who saw the future of energy, but as a man who brought a singular warmth to the rigorous world of plasma physics. The community struggled to reconcile the fact that a life dedicated to the advancement of humanity could be cut short by a grievance rooted in the distant past. The physical landscape of both campuses shifted as the memorial took shape. In front of the Boris and Holly building and near the Loureiro family home in Brookline, makeshift tributes began to grow. These were not just collections of flowers and candles, they were testaments to the lives of Ella Cook, Muhammad Aziz Umurzakov, and Professor Loureiro. For Ella, dozens of nursing stethoscopes were draped over a stone bench, symbolizing the care she would have provided to thousands. For Muhammad, students left journals filled with neuroscientific sketches and notes in multiple languages, honoring his global journey toward understanding the human mind. For the professor, ornate mathematical proofs were written in chalk on the pavement, a silent tribute to a man who spent his life solving the most difficult equations of the natural world. Beyond the physical tributes, a massive outpouring of support led to the creation of several memorial funds. Within days, millions were raised to support the victims' families and to establish scholarships in their names. These funds were designed to ensure that the work they started in nursing, in neuroscience, and in physics would be carried forward by future generations of scholars who shared their passion. As the investigation officially concludes and the 7 confession tapes are archived, we're left with a final reflection that challenges our sense of security. The case of Claudio Manuel Neves Valente is a stark reminder of the complexity of the human condition. It forces us to ask a difficult question. If a man can harbor a meticulous long-term plan within the sterile walls of a storage unit while walking among us unnoticed for years, how do we truly know our neighbors? Valente was not a ghost. He was a person who interacted with rental car agents, hotel clerks, and witnesses. He was a man who had once been a peer to those he targeted. His ability to maintain a veneer of normalcy while navigating a landscape of decades-old resentment is a sobering reality. It suggests that the most profound threats are sometimes not found in the chaotic or the obvious, but in the quiet, focused dedication of a person who has decided that their own narrative is the only one that matters. The logic Valente used to justify his exit strategy was as rigid as the physics he once studied. He viewed the world as a series of balances and debts, failing to account for the intrinsic value of the lives he touched. While he claimed to be leaving on his own terms, the true legacy of this event is not his words or his videotapes. The legacy belongs to Ella, Muhammad, and Nuno, 3 individuals whose contributions to the world were rooted in growth, healing, and discovery. The academic world will eventually heal, and the halls of Brown and MIT will again be filled with the sound of discovery. But the lessons of the 7 confession clues will remain a permanent part of forensic history. They serve as a roadmap for understanding how deception operates and how the truth often reveals itself in the moments when a person feels most in control. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the 2025 Brown and MIT investigation. This has been a production of Cold Case Reviews. If you found this analysis important, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming explorations of true crime and the psychology of the human mind. Comment below. Now that you've heard all 7 confessions and the history behind them, does the lack of a clear, singular spark or motive make these tapes more or less chilling for you? We want to hear your thoughts on the professional envy theory and how you think institutions should move forward. Until next time, stay observant, stay curious, and stay safe.